While Vladimir Putin is there, clearly he is in charge. He is running things from the Kremlin, and he has a pretty expansionist attitude himself. So you can't just write off, well, the Russians are no good because their
Yeah.
army hasn't done very well. There are um, there are a very large number of Russians who are being conscripted into their military. Their defense industry is working 24/7, 3 shifts a day.
In a time when Europe is at war, the pressure is on to push up spending on the military. The Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has written to the Chancellor asking that military spending must increase to 2.5% of our GDP. But as we know, there are plenty of pressures on the Chancellor. Why should the armed forces be a special case? Joining us now is the former head of the British Army, Richard Dannatt. Lord Dannatt, morning to you, Richard.
Yes, hello, good morning.
I suspect you won't surprise us by saying you think there should be more money spent on armed forces in this country.
Well, I'm the first to accept that the Chancellor has got a real problem in deciding how he's going to announce the budget, what's going to be in the budget on Wednesday. But I'm afraid you can't get away from the fact that there's a bloody, brutal war going on in Europe at the present moment, and that we have an absolute duty to support the Ukrainians and also to make sure that we look after our own security. So it does make spending on defense a pretty strong case, in fact, a very strong case. But I think we all probably all accept that actually political pressures at home are going to mean that notwithstanding the strength of the case to spend more on defence, and it's a very strong case, I don't actually expect the Chancellor will do that on Wednesday.
Do you think the Ministry of Defence has kind of harmed its argument because there's a track record of its spending is pretty shoddy? If you look at the Ajax tank system, billions of pounds spent, no tanks actually provided. Is that a worry that ultimately, as a department, it doesn't seem that trustworthy when it comes to being given lots of money to spend?
I think that's a poor argument, I'm afraid. I've heard that for many times. Um, um, it wasn't soldiers, sailors, or airmen that actually designed or misdesigned the Ajax. I'm afraid it was down to industry. And also the Ministry of Defence's procurement system. But putting that to one side, I only have to put that to one side. The fact of the matter is that there is a brutal war going on in Ukraine at the present moment. Yes, okay, the UK believes it's done pretty well by giving the Ukrainians better part of £5 billion over the last 2 years. But given that our defence budget is £50 billion, the really big issue at the present moment is making sure that the Russians do not prevail in Europe. The Russians do not prevail in Ukraine. So there's a very strong case to say we should be giving the Ukrainians more to support them more, to make sure that they can see off the Russian threat, which is in all our interests. And of course, and then it's totally related to it, is that we should be increasing our own defence spending. In your trailer, you said we should be going up to 2.5%. I think there's a very strong case to say that we should be going beyond that to 3%, possibly even up to 4%, because the first duty of government is to look after the security of this country. And we do face, as we did in the 1930s, which was a threat from Hitler, we've now got a threat from Vladimir Putin and a very aggressive Russia. There are significant threats to the security of Europe and by extension to this country.
Is that threat as significant as it was in the 30s? You draw the comparison because one lesson some people have learned, drawn from Ukraine in the last few years is that the Russian army is pretty shonky. It has got an ability to get into a meat grinder war in Ukraine, but it hasn't demonstrated any great facility at success in that. Actually, the lesson isn't that Russia is a massive threat, is that Russia is only a limited threat.
Well, it would be nice to think that was the case. But I think actually you have to look beyond the poor performance of the Russian army to look at their overall capabilities, not the least of which is their air force capability. But I think also it's the intention. While Vladimir Putin is there, clearly he is in charge. He is running things from the Kremlin, and he has a pretty expansionist attitude himself. So you can't just write off, well, the Russians are no good because their army hasn't done very well. There are a very large number of Russians who are being conscripted into their military. Their defense industry is working 24/7, 3 shifts a day, producing the equipment that they need. So we would be foolish if we just, from a wishful thinking point of view, felt that well, Russia's no threat because they haven't done very well in Ukraine. The fact of the matter is they shouldn't be in Ukraine at all. and that, frankly, if they were being led in a sensible fashion, like most other European countries are led in a sensible fashion, this wouldn't be an issue that we would need to be talking about.
Do you think it's wishful thinking they'd say 4%, Richard? Because you made a very cogent case for it, but everything we hear about for the current state of the finances, as you say, 2.5% feels like a stretch. 4% feels like it's never going to happen.
Well, you could well be right, but think back to the days of the Cold War when we spent 5% on defense. Now, that 5% on defense actually brought us a degree of deterrence that for many, many years deterred the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact from being expansionist into Western Europe. That is the cost of deterrence. You have to offset that going back to the 1930s to the cost of a disastrous war.
Yeah.
Just think on these figures. In 1935, we spent less than 3% on defense. In 1939, when appeasement had failed and war began, we spent 18% on defense. And in 1940, when we were fighting for our very lives, it was 46%. That's the cost of a disastrous war. The premium of deterrence is probably more than the 2.3% we're spending
Yeah.
at the present moment.
It's a really interesting way of putting it. Just before you go, Richard, the front page of the Times today has the Germans revealing sensitive details of British operations on the ground in Ukraine. They were talking on an unencrypted video call. The Russians have got their hands on it. The Russians are making a big play of it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I was very disappointed to read that story. I think the German Air Force officers who were talking on an open line, frankly, they should be censured pretty heavily. They are suggesting that there are British people in Ukraine. It's not for you or me to comment on that. We have provided a lot of equipment to them. We've provided a lot of training. As far as I'm concerned, I think what they were talking about was whether they would or wouldn't supply a German system akin to our Storm Shadow. I suspect that we do our training on Storm Shadow either in this country or in Poland or elsewhere. It's not for you or I to confirm or deny whether they're British military in Ukraine.
That's a fair point. Richard, good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.
That's Richard Dannatt, Lord Dannatt, the former head of the British Army.